Okay guys, so you just wrote a quiz on binomial multiplication, which is when you're given something like this and you multiply it out. And you can either use, the arrows, which is 2x times x is 2x squared times, 2x times 3, which is 6x, 5 times x, which is 5x, and 5 times 3, which is 15. Or you could use one of those charts instead if you wanted, right? And then you put the 2x and the 5 and the x plus 3, and you get the same numbers, right? Like we get the same numbers, they're just organized differently, right? And then we always combine these two or those two to get our final answer, which is 2x squared plus 11x plus 15. Now factoring, which is what we're going to be doing from now until the end of the unit, basically, is working backwards. So we are given this, and we need to turn it back into this. Okay. Now it really comes down to these patterns that we've seen, and that's why I had you kind of trying to do it from the chart last week on your own. Now let's kind of talk about the relationship that these numbers have. So what we have to figure out first when we're doing this is what are the two numbers that go in the middle, the 6x and the 5x, or in this table the 6x and the 5x. What are the numbers that go in the middle and how do they relate to the question? So the 6 and the 5, if we look at the question, and now the questions are going to be the trinomial, so it's going to be things like 2x squared plus 11x plus 15. Now, what relationship do 6 and 5 have to this equation? And I wish I was there to kind of talk it through with you guys and see if anybody can actually see the relationship. But since I'm not, I'm just going to have to kind of tell you. The 6 and the 5, if you notice, they add up to what? The 11. And that one's maybe easy, that they have to add up to the middle term. Okay, they have to add up. Now, they also have to multiply to something. Now, 6 times 5 is 30. That, in our question, is a little bit trickier because it's a little bit harder to see. There's no 30 in that equation, but if I notice, I have 2 and 15. And 2 and 15 do, in fact, make 30. So a lot of this comes down to that. Okay, this idea that finding these two numbers. And these two numbers, it's really, really important that you, no matter what method, I'm going to teach you 2 different methods, and no matter which method you use, you need to find, two numbers that add to the middle number and multiply to the product of the first and last. Okay, product means multiply. That word there means multiply. Okay, multiplication, so it means two numbers multiplied together. Okay, so that is really, really important. That is the main step of factoring. There's a bunch of steps that come after it, but you can't do them unless you find those two numbers that add up to that middle number and multiply to the last number. Okay, to the first times the last number. Okay, so let's look at an example, and then I'm going to show you the actual steps to doing this. I'm going to show you 2 different ways. Okay, I'm going to show you a way called decomposition, which is similar kind of to the arrow method, right? Not using a chart, just using the arrows. It's pretty much working backwards like that. And then I will also show you what we call the box method, which is using the chart. Okay, so I'll show you both. And we're going to look at a couple examples here. Okay, so the first thing I do is I figure out what my two numbers have to add to and what my two numbers have to multiply to. So I have some number plus some number has to equal 11, okay, when they add up, and the same two numbers have to multiply to, and it's the first times the last, and including the negative, so they have to multiply to negative 42. Now, if they multiply to negative 42, this is when things kind of get a little bit tricky for people. It means that one of them will have to be negative, because the only way you get a negative is if you do a positive times a negative. Okay, so that's why it has to. Now, some people can get these numbers really fast, and some of you might even have them already. I don't know. Okay, you might already know. And if you're good at multiplication, it's easier. But even if you're terrible at multiplication, you can still do this. The way you do it is you write the number that they have to multiply over here, and you write down all the things that multiply together to give you 42, just like we were doing when we were making the factor lists. So like 1 and 42, 2 and 21, 3 and 14, 4 doesn't work, 5 doesn't work, 6 and 7, and then I've met in the middle, so that's all of them now. Now I look at these and I think, is there any way that I could put these together to make 11? So 1 and 42, no, because if I add them I get 43, if I subtract them I get 41, either way it's not 11. Okay, 2 and 21, so 1 and 42 don't work. Okay, 1 and 21, or sorry, 2 and 21, if I add them I get either 23, or if I subtract them I get 19, so again doesn't work. Okay, 3 and 14, if I add 3 and 14 together I get 17. If I subtract them I get 11. Okay, so it's going to be 3 and 14. 3 and 14. Now the question is which one of them will be negative? And some people I find just end up guessing. It's really important that you pick the correct thing. So I just try it on my calculator. I go negative 3 plus 14 and 3 plus negative 14, and I check which one works. So negative 3 plus 14 gives me 11, and 3 plus negative 14 gives me negative 11. Now since I want positive, I put the negative with the 3. Okay, and that's how you do it. So we found our two numbers. So this is, like I said, the most important step, I think. Even though there's a whole bunch of other steps after that, that's the most important of the steps. So we found those two numbers. Now I'm going to show you, no matter which method you use, that's what you have to start with. That is always the first step. Now, if we use, do what we call decomposition, or it's called by grouping sometimes. Okay, decomposition. If you Google it, you might find people calling it by grouping. Okay. Okay, so what you do is it's just like when that middle step when you're multiplying with the arrows. So what I do is I put those two numbers I just got, the negative 3 and the 14, I'm replacing the 11. So I write negative 3x plus 14x minus 7. So what you need to notice is that this 6, the 6x squared, and the negative 7 are the same, and the middle two together make 11. So I haven't changed the value of my original equation, okay, my original expression. It hasn't changed. It's exactly the same. The first and the last term are still identical, and the middle term has just been split into two different parts. This is just like when you're doing your arrows, right? And you've multiplied them out, and it's right before you add up those two middle numbers. Okay, that's what we're doing here. Now what you do is you add brackets around the first two things and around the last two things. This is why it's called group by grouping sometimes, because we're kind of grouping those first two and the last two together. It doesn't matter what order you put the two things in the middle. So it does not matter if it's negative 3 and then 14, or if it's 14 and then negative 3. Does not change anything. Okay, so now what we do is we look at each group. Okay, and what we do is we remove a common factor, like we've been doing with expressions earlier. So I look at 6x squared and 3x, and I think to myself, what number goes into both 3 and 6? And the answer is 3, hopefully. Okay, and then I look and I have x squared squared, because it's 6x squared, and I have 3x, and since they both have an x, I can take an x. And then I think, okay, just like I thought at the beginning of this unit, what do I need to multiply 3x by to get 6x squared? And the answer is 2x, because 3x times 2x is 6x squared. And what do I have to multiply 3x by to get 3x? It's minus 1. Okay. Then I look at the next set of brackets, so the 14x and the minus 7, and I think, what goes into 14 and 7? And hopefully you come up with 7 does. So it's plus 7. And then I think the same thing. What do I have to multiply 7 by to get 14x? And it's 2x. And what do I have to multiply 7 by to get 7? And it's negative 1. Now my factors, where are they? Okay, here they are. First of all, you'll notice if you've done this correctly that these two are always the same. That's one of my factors. That's what I call it. I call it a factor, so I write it down first. Now the other one, because there's always two, where it's like looking like those multiplying binomial questions. The other one is what's left over. So in this case, it's 3x plus 7. Okay. Now, this is the answer. This is what we're looking for, is this factored form. We're looking for this thing, this binomial multiplication. Now, I can check this, and honestly, I get really kind of annoyed, I'll be honest with people, in this unit when they ask me if their answers are right, because you can check. Okay, the check is really easy. You just expand this. Use your arrows and expand it. I get 6x squared. Okay, I get 14x. I get minus 3x, and I get minus 7. Now look at that. That's exactly the same as this line up here. It's just, well, the 14 and the 3 are split up, but it's identical. Okay, and then I can put those two together. So I get 6x squared plus 11x minus 7, which, if I look way up at the top, was what I started with. So since it's the same as what I started with, I know I did it right. Okay, I must have done it right. That's just the only thing that it could possibly be. Okay, so let's look at, this is called decomposition. Okay, it's the first method. I will be doing another one, I promise. Okay, but you need to have this written down. Like if you don't have this written down, you are not going to be able to do it. So I'm just going to wait. It's going to be a boring minute, but I'm going to wait 1 minute so that those people who have not written this down can write it down. So please write down all of it. Okay. Okay, so as you're just hopefully finishing writing, if you haven't already written it, maybe I should have talked about this earlier, but this is like extremely important and it's not easy. This is, like I said at the beginning, this is what I was talking about when I talked about this being the most important unit of the course. Okay, so you need to know how to do this. And I say that every year, and there's still students who never learn how. And as you can see, it's not like a super long process, but it's also not short. There are several steps. So please, please, please make sure that you have this written down and that you know how to, that you can follow along with the steps. You don't need to know both methods, so you're about to see the other method. You can pick which one you like the best, but I want you to have at least one copy of each one written down. Let's look at the next method. So this is the exact same question. So same thing as before. We look at the two numbers, right, that add up to 11 and multiply to negative 42, and that comes from 6 times negative 7, in case you forgot. Okay, and remember, we already came up with them. It's negative 3 and 14. So I'm not going to show you how to do that again, but you would have to do that step, even with this method. Okay, now I find that a lot of students like this method. I actually find almost every year that my class is split pretty close to 50-50. I would say that this method usually has a little bit more people to it, like more like a few more people do this method than the other method. So this method, you draw your box or your chart, and if you want to draw it like the whole chart, you can. Like if you want to draw it like this is fine. Like however you want to draw it is fine by me. Okay, so just however, sorry, I'm going to draw it again. I don't like how that looks. But however you want to draw it. So some people just draw it as a box. Some people draw it as like the whole chart. I'm just going to draw a box. That's how I usually do it. Okay, and so what I do is I put in, okay, the first number up here and the last number down there. That's like what you did yesterday. You started this, and you know that those are always going to be the case. It's always going to be the first and the last there. And then what goes in the last two boxes are these two numbers, okay, or those two numbers. So I put negative 3. Now it's really important. It has to be negative 3x, not just negative 3. Okay, and it has to be 14x, not just 14. And again, it does not matter what order you put things in. Now this is the part that's really important. Okay, yesterday you were probably just kind of guessing what the numbers could be. And I remember, I told you things like, oh, it's going to have to be something that multiplies to 6, because this is like a multiplication table, so it's going to have to be like 2 and 3 or 6 and 1 or whatever, which is great, but there is a way to do it without guessing. So the way to do it without guessing is you look down the first column, and by that I mean you look at these two numbers. So I look at 6x squared and 14x, and I ask myself, what number goes into both 6 and 14, the largest number? So it's 2. And it's x squared and x, so I can take an x. This is just removing a common factor, just like we did earlier with the other method. Okay, now I have negative 3 and negative 7. Now if the first number in your row or column is negative, so like the negative 3 is negative, I take out a negative. And 3 and 7, what goes into both 3 and 7? What I hear a lot of students say, nothing. Nothing goes into 3 and 7. Well, it's not nothing. 1 goes into both 3 and 7. So if nothing else works, 1 works. Okay, then I look at the rows. And at this point, you can either continue on this process and ask yourself the common factor, or you can look at it like a multiplication chart. So knowing that at the top I have 2x, I can think, well, what do I have to multiply 2x by to get 6x squared? And it's 3x. Okay, but it would also work if you just looked at 6x squared and 3x and said, well, what's the greatest thing that goes into them? It's 3x. And then what do I have to multiply 2x by to get 14x? And it's 7. And it's plus 7 because the first thing there, the 14, is positive. But what you really have to make sure of at the end is that your table actually works. So I'm just going to write it out again to show you how you make sure of that. But like, normally I wouldn't write it twice. I would just do it in my head and make sure that it actually works. But you're doing, on yourself, you're thinking 2x and 3x make 6x squared. Negative 1 and 3 makes negative 3x. 2 and 7 makes 14x. And 7 and negative 1 makes negative 7. And just check that it's the same. Okay, and that it all multiplies out properly. Okay, now if you've done that, there's your answer. 2x minus 1. 3x plus 7. And you could also use your arrows at the end and make sure that that is still equal to the top thing. Now, see, I think a lot of students like this because it looks like less work. There's a little chart instead of all the lines. Yeah, so either way, it is identical. It really is, because you're still removing the factor. We're just writing it out differently. So write this method down too. And try to kind of keep up with where the numbers came from. I know it's a little bit tough sometimes, so you have to think about when you're looking at your work, when you're working and you're looking at the examples, you have to like always be thinking about, well, where did they get that number from? So like, where did the 6x squared in my chart come from? Well, it came from the first number in my line, in my equation. Where did the negative 7 come from? It came from the last. Okay, that kind of thing. Okay, so you're going to look at these notes while you're practicing. Okay, so let's do this one together. Okay, so I'm going to do it both methods. Okay, so I'll do decomposition first. So decomposition or box method, I always start by finding the sum and the product, okay, what they add up to and what they multiply to. So they add up to the middle number. Now, what's the middle number in this case? Sorry, guys. Okay, so when you look at this, yeah, some people might be like, what's the middle number? The middle number, if there's no number there in front of the x, is 1. Okay, now it's the same thing because we multiply the first number by the last number. Okay, in this case, it's 1 and negative 42. So it's negative 42 again. I didn't realize it was going to be the same number. But that's okay. Okay, so negative 42. And so remember, again, is one of them's going to have to be positive, one of them's going to have to be negative to get that negative number. So it's 1 times 42, 2 times 21, 3 times 14, because remember we did these already, 6 times 7. Now, which one of these, if I put them together, can make 1? So 42 and 1 can make 43, or it can make 41. That's it. 2 and 21 can make 23 or 19, so that doesn't work. 3 and 14 can make 11 or 17. Now 6 and 7 can add up to 13, or if I subtract them, I get 1. So it's 6 and 7. And I check, right? I go 6 plus 7, okay, and it's negative 6 plus 7, or 6 plus negative 7, and I check which one gives me 1. And it's the top one gives me 1. So I put the negative with the 6. Okay, if I put the negative with the 7, I would get negative 1. So that's how you do that. Okay, now if you're doing decomposition, you write out your first term, so it's just x squared. Then you write these two, and it doesn't matter what order you put them in. Okay, it does not matter at all. I want to show you it in this order, which is different than the order I put it in last time, to just show you something with the negatives. So when you put your, the next step is putting brackets around the first two and the last two. Now, if there's a negative here, like there is with the negative 6, you have to put it in the brackets. That's important. So if there's a negative, you have to put it in there. Now we take something out of each set of brackets. So I look at x squared and 7x, and I ask myself, well, what can come out of x squared and 7x? So really, in front of the x squared, there's a 1. So I'm looking at 1 and 7. The only thing that can come out of 1 and 7 is 1. And there's an x squared and an x, so I can pull out an x. Okay, and then x times what gives me x squared? Well, x. And x times what gives me 7x? And it's 7. Okay, now here I have negative 6x and negative 42. What goes into both of those numbers? What's the highest thing that goes into both of them? And it's 6. Now, since they're both negative, since the first one, it's really the first one is negative. If the first one is negative, you pull out a negative. Okay, and then it's negative 6 times what gives you negative 6x? That's x. And negative 6 times what gives you negative 42. And so this is like I have a negative and I want a negative, so it has to be positive 7. Now I also know it has to be positive 7 because those two have to be the same, because remember that's one of my answers, x plus 7. And then where's the other answer again? It's what's outside. So it's x minus 6. And there we go, that's my answer. Okay, so a quick check is multiplying those out using your arrows. So I do that, that's x squared minus 6x plus 7x minus 42. And if I put the middle ones together, that's 1. So it's 6x, or x squared plus 1x minus 42, which is what I want it to be. So it must be correct. Okay, so what I'm checking, right, is that it matches what's up at the top. Okay, so there we go. That's decomposition. So I personally, if I am factoring and I'm having trouble, because sometimes, you know, I actually, I really like, I factor in my head most of the time. I don't use a method. And I will work on that with some of you, like towards the end of the unit. A lot of people will never get to that. But if you are a very strong math student, I really will start to kind of encourage you to try to do that in your head, because I think it's a really important skill and a really good skill to have. But so I don't usually use either method. If I do use a method, I use decomposition if I'm like struggling. So just so you know that, full honesty, but I do like the box method, and I've seen lots of students be very similar. Okay, so here's the box method again. So with the box method, I still have to do that where I think, okay, what do they add up to? They add up to 1. What do they multiply to? They multiply to negative 42, and I still have to make that list. Like, that whole thing is still here. But because we've already done it once, I'll just finish it here, negative 6 and 7. So we make our box, okay, and we put in the first thing, so x squared. I put in the last thing, negative 42. And then I put in those two numbers. So I put 7x and negative 6x in whichever order. Okay, then remember I look up here. So x squared and negative 6x, the only thing that can make that is x. Then I look up here, 7 and negative 42. 7 goes into that, so it's plus 7. The reason it's plus 7 is because the 7, the top one, is positive. Then I just do it like it's a multiplication chart. So I think x times what gives me x squared, and it's x. And x times what gives me negative 6x. Or you could, if you don't like that, you could think 7 times what gives me negative 42. It should give you the same answer either way, but it's negative 6. So there we go. My answer is x plus 7, x minus 6. And I've already arrowed it out, but you could arrow it out here too if you wanted. Also kind of check that this works. So x times x is x squared, 7 times x is 7x, x times negative 6 is negative 6x, 7 times negative 6 is negative 42. So the whole thing works. So it looks pretty good. Okay, so both of these methods are awesome. I do think that box method can be slightly quicker, maybe, I don't know, but whichever method you prefer. Okay, they're both good. I'll be showing this again, or more of these tomorrow. But for now, you've seen 2 examples. I want you guys to really be trying this on this assignment. This is an assignment that's going to be handed out right away after I do a couple more quick examples of something a little bit different. This assignment's for marks, so it needs to get done. I will be here tonight at the school, or sorry, no, not tonight. I will be here tomorrow night at the school, and I'll be here tomorrow in class as well to help you work on it. But you should be starting because it is for marks, okay? So the last thing I want to go over is something really easy that's called difference, and write it down, of squares, okay? So difference of squares is a specific type of factoring. So what does the word difference mean in math? It means subtract. Okay? That's what difference means. So when we talk difference of squares, people forget this part. Even though it's like the easiest part of this unit, people forget it, and I hate to see it. I hate to see people lose marks on it. So try to remember this. The difference means subtraction. So I have to have a subtraction in the problem. And then squares, when it says squares, it means those square numbers like 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, so forth. Okay, so that's 1 squared, 2 squared, 3 squared, 4 squared, 5 squared, 6 squared, and so forth. Okay, so when it says difference of squares, it means that we're subtracting those square numbers from one another. So for instance, this is one here, x squared minus 25, because x squared is square, it has the square on it, and 25 is squared, so it's a square as well, and they're subtracting. So when this happens, there's a special rule I'm allowed to use. I don't need to do the box method or anything, okay? Because there's just an easy, simple rule that always works. So all the time, you draw your brackets, and in the first part of the bracket, you put the square root of whatever that number is. So the square root of x squared is x. So you put x in both of them. And then you take the square root of the second number, which is 5, okay, in this case, and you put 5 in both of them. And then you make one of them plus and one of them minus. And that's it. That's the answer. Okay, so that's a very easy process. This works. I'll show you, like, when I multiply it out, what happens and why it works. So hopefully you can see. I have x times x is x squared. X times negative 5 is negative 5x. 5 times x is positive 5x. And 5 times negative 5 is negative 25. And the middle two, since I have minus 5 and plus 5, they cancel off. So I'm just left with that x squared minus 25. So this always works this way. Okay, so it's a really nice, simple rule. So please try to remember it. You just take the square root of the first, square root of the last, make 1 plus, 1 minus, order doesn't matter. That's it. Okay, let's do one more just to cut it out again. Okay, write it down. Okay, so 4x squared minus 81. So right away, I draw my two sets of brackets. And I think, what's the square root of 4x squared? Okay, so what times itself will give me 4x squared? And the answer is 2x. Now that's just because the square root of 4 is 2, and the square root of x squared is x. So it's 2x. And then it's, what's the square root of 81? It's 9. And then I put 1 minus, 1 plus, just like that. And I have my answer. And it's that easy. It's wonderful. Okay, these ones are really easy. I'll just do one quick more one just to show you one that's like slightly harder, but it's still not super tough or anything. If you are given one where you have a hot number higher than squared, like say I was giving you something like 16x6 minus 25y squared. Okay, this one looks harder because there's a y and an x, plus there's a 6, like the power 6, that's hard. Okay, but it's actually really similar. So be careful. First of all, what I would expect to see a couple of people make a mistake and put 8x instead of with the 16. But actually the square root of 16 is 4, so it's going to be 4. Now, what's the square root of x to the power of 6? It's actually x to the power of 3. Because x to the power of 3 times x to the power of 3 is x to the power of 6. So it's 4x cubed. Now at the end, the last thing, because it's 25, the square root of 25 is 5. And the square root of y squared is y. And then 1's plus, 1's minus, and there's my answer. Okay, so that's all there is to it. That's difference of squares. So the very first part of your little assignment there is difference of squares. There might be a couple that you can't do yet. We're going to continue to see factoring tomorrow. We're going to look at some like harder ones and some ones with common factors in them, which is important. So if you get to one that you aren't sure what to do, skip it for now. Okay, do the simple ones. So do all the ones that look exactly like this, and then do all the ones with the box method or with decomposition that look easy. Okay, we will be seeing some slightly harder ones. We're going to be seeing them tomorrow and the next day. We do have a few more days of this, and then we're going to look at some applications and stuff. So this is a pretty long unit, and it's hard. It's really hard. And unless you're very good at math, you're going to need quite a lot of practice at this. So please don't waste your time in class today. Please use it trying to get through some of these easier problems so that you can focus on the hard ones tomorrow and the next day. Okay, so the teacher is going to go ahead and hand out the factoring number 2 assignment. Thank you guys, and I will see you tomorrow because I'll be back.